And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things, which is reinforcement and punishment. If you already know about this, I encourage you to use this as a refresher. And I'll have a couple handouts, one for us to practice, one as a little cheat sheet that you can put in your office to help you remember. This is usually what I talk about in my first or second class in our master's program, and so it kind of helps you understand how behavior changes and how you can get the behaviors that you want and minimize the behaviors that you don't want. And so I'll share this, and I'll share my, I have a Google Drive with these documents in it as well as the slides, and so I'll share those for you all to have access to after. Where's the...
What are you looking for?
The arrows.
Oh, I know.
So
It's all squished together.
yes, a couple things that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to use terms in a different way than how we usually use these terms. So we see these words, negative, punishment, positive, and reinforcement, a lot in everyday life, but we're going to talk about them in a different way than we usually do. And so just to preface it, negative, when we talk about negative in terms of behavior, negative doesn't mean bad, it means removing something. So when I say negative, I mean taking something away, whether it's physically taking something away or removing something like attention. When I say punishment, that's not something that happens because you did something bad. Punishment is just decreasing behavior. If a behavior decreases, that's punishment. And so we're going to get more into this, but that's an important thing to know. So punishment doesn't mean bad. Punishment doesn't mean what happens because you did something wrong. It's just behavior is decreasing, even if it's a quote-unquote good behavior. Did you have a question?
So punishment meaning like consequences for the actions?
Punishment meaning, so we'll say that punishment happens if something follows a behavior and that behavior decreases. Okay. Whether we want it to decrease or not doesn't matter. It's just if the behavior decreases, that means punishment happened. Okay. Positive means adding something. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean something good, it just means something has been added. And reinforcement is the opposite of punishment. So if reinforcement happens, that means behavior increases. So whether you want it to or not, reinforcement just means behavior increases. So we think of these, we have connotations already associated with these words. We think of positive and reinforcement as good and negative and punishment as bad. But when we're talking about the science of behavior, we remove those connotations. So it's something is removed, something is added, behavior decreases, behavior increases. So that's what those mean. So those, I'm going to talk about putting each of these words together, which is going to be the bulk of what we're talking about today, but I wanted to introduce that. We're also not going to say words like bad and good when we talk about behavior, because that tends to hold, I've heard kids say, I'm a bad kid, and it's because people talk about them engaging in bad behaviors, and that they start to internalize that language. And so instead of saying bad and good, I'm going to use words like undesirable behavior, challenging behavior, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of behavior, not the individual. So talk about a student or an adult or a person who engages in undesirable behavior or challenging behavior instead of bad behavior. And then saying that we're trying to teach desirable behavior, replacement behavior, pro-social behavior instead of good behavior, because it takes the connotation out of it and puts some more context to it. And that's just general rule of thumb when I talk about behavior at all. So first, I think you might have talked with Megan about defining behaviors a little bit. Anytime that we're talking about reinforcement and punishment, I always like to start by discussing defining behavior. I'm not going to get into it too much since I think you've already talked about it a little bit, but just to know that when you're talking about reinforcement and punishment, it's important to know which behavior you're reinforcing and punishing. So making sure that you're picking something that is specific, observable, and measurable. So a behavior that you can see, that you can define, that everyone understands exactly what you're talking about. What counts when you're talking about a certain behavior? So asking, can you see it? What does it look like? What do they do when they engage in that behavior? And then if you're picking behaviors to reinforce or punish, behaviors you want to change, making sure you're prioritizing behaviors that are dangerous, that affect relationships with others, or influence the environment. So anytime you're picking a behavior to target, a lot of times, I see this a lot in schools too, and I think it translates here. Teachers will pick behaviors that are annoying, but they aren't necessarily as meaningful to change. They won't pick the behavior that's really a barrier to the student because they prioritize the one that's more annoying to them. And so really focusing on, is there a dangerous behavior, or is there a behavior that if you change it, it opens up their environment. It gives them more access to other settings or communities. Those are the behaviors we want to prioritize. And then we talk about them in terms of what we can see. So by that, I mean, these are examples. So someone might say that student is angry. Well, they might be angry, but I always ask, how do you know? What do you see? And so if you're talking about that, you might say they're engaging in aggression, or this is the one exception to my rule, negative vocalization. So they might be saying no, or I don't want to, or cussing. They might be engaging in disruption, so tearing materials, swiping materials. These are things that we can see. These are behaviors that might indicate anger. And so trying to talk about these observable behaviors rather than the emotions that are tied to it. Another example, if a student is lazy or unmotivated, if I saw that, I would say, how do you know? That's an assumption that we're making. So you might say instead they're off task. Or I need to change this because I don't like this term anymore, but non-compliant. So you might say they're not following directions. Or if they're in a job setting, they might not be fulfilling their responsibilities. You might also talk about latency to respond. If they're given a direction, how long does it take them to fulfill it? They might eventually do it, but it might take them way too long to engage in that behavior. Raising their hand. So what does lazy or unmotivated actually look like? That takes the connotation out of it. That takes the if you say lazy or unmotivated, it might accidentally imply something that you don't mean, and it might make someone defensive, and not everyone might agree on what that looks like. You might think it's lazy or unmotivated. I might think it's taking extra time to think and respond. But if we say we're trying to decrease how long it takes for them to start work, okay, we can all agree on that. Whether I think that's them thinking or you think it's unmotivated, we can agree we're trying to decrease that time. So just being objective about that so we're all on the same page. This is another one. Sometimes I've heard people say they just want to be in control or they always want to be right. That's not something we can see. That's an assumption that we're making. And so instead, again, I need to change this word. You might say they're not following directions, or they are not completing responsibilities or tasks, or you might say they are engaging in inappropriate vocalizations, so saying things they shouldn't. I would say those things I can see and record, rather than saying they want to be in control. Am I going too fast? Doing okay? Super. So, like I said, I just like to talk about these generally, about how to select appropriate behaviors that you're then going to reinforce or punish. But we're going to prioritize reinforcement because that in general is better, says science. When are you going to use this? When you're selecting behaviors, if you're consulting about a challenging behavior or inappropriate behavior, if you're collaborating with another teacher, professor, professional, someone in the community, a job partner, or speaking with the student that you're working with, or writing a growth plan. Any of these things are good times when you might be thinking about selecting an appropriate behavior and then making sure that it's something that's observable, that you can measure, that everyone's on the same page about. And then when you apply it, reasons it's important, making sure everyone's on the same page so that everyone in this room knows if we are talking about we're all trying to reinforce this behavior and make sure it happens more. What's an example of something you want your students to do more of?
Turn in their assignments on time.
Turn in assignments on time. Great. And so if you're trying to reinforce that behavior, you would talk about what exactly does that look like? So what behavior are you reinforcing? What exactly are they turning in? What is on time? what's wiggle room, if it's 5 minutes late, is it still on time? So you would talk through what exactly that looks like, so you're all on the same page. Yeah.
What happens if we done that part in that step? But
That's when the
we
reinforcement part's going to come in.
Okay.
So first we're going to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And so just different examples of when you might use this. When students have been gone for a break and are coming back, that's another really good time to make sure everyone's on the same page, including the students. So when we're talking about specific, observable, measurable behavior, this is a helpful way to talk to our students too. I do this in my classroom downstairs in 614 all the time. We talk about, I don't know if you've been in there and seen the posters, we talk about what professional behavior looks like. Whenever I give an assignment, I provide a rubric so they know, I tell them, read the rubric and grade yourself, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm telling you what I'm looking for. So you can do that with your students too, through this specific behavior.
Okay.
So that's, like I said, super quick overview, but I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page about what behaviors we're talking about. Now we're going to talk about my favorite part, which is reinforcement and punishment. So this is where, remember the words we talked about. Forget what you think those words mean. Okay? So talk with someone next to you. How would you define reinforcement and how would you define punishment? Even though I already gave you the answer.
How would you define that?